Namaste and good evening, everyone. I, Ritika Gupta, Assistant Director at IMPRI Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan, New Delhi, extend my heartiest welcome to you all to this hashtag Web Policy Talk. Today, we are here for a special talk as part of the series, The State of Employment, hashtag Employment Debate, and book discussion on impact of COVID-19, reforms, and poor governance on labor rights. The book is being authored by Professor K.R. Shyam Sundar. The talk is being organized by Center for Work and Welfare at IMPRI, Working People's Charter, Counterview, and Indian Social Institute at New Delhi. I would now like to welcome Dr. Simi Mehta, who is CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI, to introduce our speaker for today and distinguished panelists and the program further. Ma'am, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritika. Good evening to all, and I welcome you to this very important web policy talk. It is my honor to introduce to you the speaker for the day, Professor K.R. Shyam Sundar. Professor Shyam Sundar is working as a professor of human resources management at the Xavier Labor Relations Institute, XLRI, Xavier Business School in Jamshedpur. He holds a PhD degree in economics from Mumbai University. He has published extensively over 75 research articles and book reviews in the field of industrial relations and labor economics, and is a well-known researcher in this field. He has written more than 95 research articles in the print and electronic media on the contemporary themes in the world of work. He has published 13 books and edited 5 books on various themes in industrial relations and labor regulation. He has been very widely quoted in the print and internet media on contemporary issues about industrial relations and labor law reforms, and has appeared in multiple TV programs. Professor Sundar has done several research projects for organizations like the International Labour Organization for both New Delhi and Geneva offices, the European Union, Public Service International, the Institute for Human Development, etc. Professor Sundar has been a visiting fellow at the International Institute of Labour Studies, International Labour Office, Geneva, during October-November 2006. He was selected to visit China during November 2008 as part of the cultural exchange program between India and China to study labor law reforms in China. He was invited to make a special presentation at the high-level tripartite meeting to commemorate the completion of 60 years of passage of ILO Convention on Collective Bargaining in October 2009. He was also invited to deliver the keynote addresses at the annual conference of Indian Society for Labor Economics, ISLE, during 2009 and 14. He has played an instrumental role in organizing panel discussions at the ISLE conference and has been a member of its executive committee for several years and is also a member currently. He has also been a referee for several peer-reviewed journals like the Indian Journal of Labor Economics, Development and Change, Industrial Law Journal, and for institutions like ICRIER, publishing houses like SAGE, etc. Professor Sundar is also on the editorial board of the Indian Journal of Labor Economics and MIT Journal of Economics. We also have with us a very important and very eminent distinguished panel. This session is being chaired by Professor Praveen, who is professor at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. We have the book release and opening remarks by Professor D.N. Reddy, who is who has retired as a professor in economics and was the former dean, School of Social Sciences, University of Hyderabad, in Hyderabad. Our distinguished panelists include Ms. Gopalakrishnan, ILO consultant and leading labor advocate. She is joining us from Chennai. Professor Babu Matthew, professor, National Law School of India University, Karnataka, and Dr. Radhika Kapoor, who is senior visiting fellow at ICRIER, New Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I welcome all of you. Over to you, Dr. Arjun. Thank you.
Thank you, Simi. So without further ado, let me invite for the opening remarks, Professor D.N. Reddy.
Over to you, Ricky. ऑडियो वाला चाहिए.
Okay, thank you, IMPRI, for inviting me to be part of this. Are you able to hear?
Yes, sir.
Hello? Okay. I thank IMPRI for inviting me to be part of this discussion and, of course, book release event. I think, extremely happy to perform this role, pleasant role of releasing the book, Impact of COVID-19 Reforms and Poor Governance on Labor Rights in India by Professor K.R. Shyam Sundar. Okay, maybe it's not visible to, the one I am holding, maybe I have to put it in more light. Anyway, I think when it comes to the question of Professor Shyam Sundar, I must say something about him before I say something about the book. Professor Shyam Sundar is an exceptionally alert and conscientious scholar who has been engaged in studying the evolving conditions of labor and employment in India. In fact, when it comes to the question of the present juncture and this book, it tells, this is an outstanding reflection of what Shyam is. Because all of us would agree that 2020 has been one of the darkest years that we have passed through. Not only because of the pandemic COVID-19, but also the way in which the present regime responded to it. But in contrast, how Professor Shyam responded to the COVID and, of course, in 2020. In fact, this book has about 42 chapters and maybe 42 articles, out of which 37 are written in 2020, one of the most productive years perhaps to Shyam. And if I closely look at further, most of them were written from April on, which would mean an average about 4 contributions per month. And I think that tells a lot about his concerns as to what is happening around and the intensity of his involvement. Another quality, and I think it could be, some of you may not have carefully looked at the beginning of the book, where he's talking in terms of Tiruvalluvar, Tirukkural, and gratitude. I think Shyam has a great quality in, let's say, expressing his gratitude to people and, of course, institutions, which have been very helpful in grooming him to what he is today. And therefore, the book begins with that of a rich tribute to the institution of Indian Society of Labor Economics. In fact, the book is dedicated to Indian Society of Labor Economics. And of course, there is a piece of tribute to one of the important persons who was instrumental in raising the Indian Society of Labor Economics to a standard that which we associate with it. It's also Professor Papola, who was also very closely involved in helping and, let's say, shaping Shyam Sundar. I mention these things because such intense involvement in not only in terms of the subject that he is studying, but also with that of, let's say, the personalities and institutions. In fact, at a time when the esteem of labor studies or labor economics was very low, it was, I think, Indian Society of Labor Economics, which has worked hard in trying to, let's say, mobilize a large number of scholars to produce quality kind of, let's say, research work, which has raised the labor economics and labor studies itself in India to a relatively high competent social science. Well, now I turn to the book, which has about 4 parts. And the 4 parts, of course, are divided into that of, let's say, the first part, I think, is on COVID-19, and then, of course, the labor market and industrial relations in India, the context. And then it moves on to the second part on labor codes, and then, of course, reforms. Let me talk about the first part quickly. I'll just refer to that. It's interesting to observe in the first part. He's trying to suggest how, of course, essentially, Professor Shyam Sundar is from the background of industrial relations system, ILS. That's where he started and then widened his horizon. And then, of course, he is a well-rounded scholar in social sciences, which perhaps takes a larger view of, let's say, labor and employment. And then when it comes to the question of the first part, he tries to suggest that the beginning of India's industrial relations, and then, of course, engagement with that of labor and labor legislation, evolved through that of, let's say, the influences of the International Labour Organization, of course, the Indian Constitution, and of course, the UN Charter Declaration of Rights. But unfortunately, the very first chapter, first part would tell us that the way in which it began and the way in which it's landed itself now. He talks in terms of the need for again reviving the spirit with which it started, and then, of course, putting it in a framework. The second part is on, let's say, the labor codes and reforms. This would be a continuous debating area. Therefore, he has about 10 chapters devoted to this. I quickly run through that of, let's say, the labor codes which are being extensively debated now. He himself contributed quite a bit. When it comes to the question of the wage code, for instance, he sees it, a couple of chapters in this book tries to look at wage code and comes to the conclusion that although it raises hopes by suggesting that there would be universal minimum wage for all employees, and there would be a transparent wage payment across the board. But when it comes to the question of the detail and the possibility of its implementation, there doesn't seem to be much of hope, because even earlier, the Minimum Wages Act had very little kind of, let's say, implementation aspect, even though it was confined to a few schedules. Even there, about 30% coverage, even that 30% is not perhaps much adequately covered. Therefore, in this background, it's very difficult to expect the way in which the code is drafted, the wage code is drafted. It would perhaps bring in a universal minimum wage to all employees. Turns to that of, let's say, industrial relations code. There are about 6 papers in it. He apparently appears to be thinking that this industrial relations code perhaps moves positively in one aspect of overcoming the past problem of recognizing the trade unions in an establishment. And then, of course, the proposal to have negotiating union or negotiating council apparently seems to solve this problem. But when it comes to the question of, let's say, the extent of benefits that are likely to come, for instance, the raising of the threshold from 100 to 300 in one stroke would eliminate about 90% of establishments. And of course, almost, let's say, 45% of, let's say, employees from the kind of, let's say, benefit that industrial relations code is expected to give. Similarly, the nature of, let's say, the so-called severance pay is very low already when it comes to the question of, let's say, fixing, but I don't know how it perhaps would suggest that it may not be in a position to satisfy. And then when it comes to the question of certain aspects of contract labor who are brought in fixed term employment would not get any kind of, let's say, benefits that go with this code, which would perhaps be substantial undoing of what perhaps is expected in this field. Perhaps the other code that he discusses, I mean, this is perhaps very well organized chapter in this book. This is on the Social Security Code. He uses the framework of this, the discussion on this Social Security Code by drawing on the preamble of the Social Security legislation, and then turning to that of, let's say, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Labor and its comments on the Social Security Code, and then, of course, the ILO's 1952 Social Security provisions extending to 9 benefits. He looks at the preamble and then it raises hopes by trying to suggest that it would lead to that of, let's say, Social Security for all employees. And then, of course, when it comes to the question of the comments made by the Parliamentary Standing Committee, that it looks like that there doesn't seem to be any way of looking at it as being treated as right, but as, I mean, it's left to sometimes the code perhaps leaves it to that of certain executive amendments to that of, let's say, the code, which would mean that it's a very callously kind of, let's say, constructed kind of a code. And then when it comes to, of course, even the timeline, there doesn't seem to be any indication it would happen soon. He tries to conclude the code does not appear to be on the journey to reach the goalposts of universalization of Social Security anywhere in the near future. In fact, about all this emerging kind of, let's say, the new legislative reforms resulting in these 4 codes, there's a larger comment, and of course, which is interesting to see that these were drafted with some kind of, let's say, this NDA government's urgency, particularly what perhaps he calls as governments in a tearing hurry after particularly 2019 to come out with this kind of reforms without paying adequate attention to that of the better legal minds which could have been drawn, better drafting skills that are extensively available in the country, and of course, the extent of the competent and comprehensive way in which it could have been designed is lost. I mean, therefore, he considers them as some kind of missed opportunity at a time when you are trying to rework the whole industrial relations system. Well, anyway, when it comes to the question of, let's say, the third part, which is very dear to that of Shyam because he is from industrial relations system, refers to that of, let's say, the governance and labor, and let's say the governance and labor statistics. One of the substantial papers or chapters in this book is on this aspect of, let's say, labor administration or labor management or labor relations system. This talks in terms of, this is I think it says substantial because about 20 pages, which also perhaps reveals in the very title itself what is happening in the name of labor administration in India. Who will penalize the laxity of on the part of the law enforcers in the administration of labor law? I mean, this is, I think, there is an extensive detailed discussion here, and there are examples from both the organized sector and then organized, though there are about only 4 visible legislative measures, that too, some of them of recent origin in the unorganized sector. But the way in which, for instance, everybody knows now, the Interstate Migrant Labor Act was drafted, and then he gives the long list of something like 11 forms to be filled by the employer and the contractor, which have never been done. And there is an interesting mention when the COVID is on, people are walking back and the misery was seen. Then there was a question under right to information about the numbers. The response of the ministry was that there doesn't seem to be any such statistics available. And that's perhaps the most distressing part of the state of affairs. And of course, the Building and Other Workers Act and how it is implemented is well known for its mismanagement or misadministration. And then he does give that about, it's a one act which has helped to mobilize a lot of money through cess, some thousands of crores, and ranges estimates 36 to 56,000 crores. But I think in 24 out of 36 states and union territories, not even half is spent. There may be 1 or 2 examples. Last time we had an example of Karnataka seems to be doing well, but by and large. The worst part is the most important thing that we as students of social science talk of in labor area is the employment. And he draws our attention the fact that even to this day, we do not have an employment policy of India. And this perhaps tells much more. And then I move on to that, the last part, because I don't want to take more time. The last part is about labor rights. And I think I just mentioned the beginning of this part, and of course, I would end my comments, that he talks in terms of the May Day of 2020. May Day, which symbolizes the struggles and sacrifices to achieve 8-hour day and let's say 48-hour week. He ends up in the hands of the administration in some of the states like UP, Rajasthan, and then of course Madhya Pradesh, where the dream of, let's say, people working 12 hours a day now in 21st century, and then of course 72 hours a week. And this is the state of labor affairs in India, of course, and it is to this that perhaps Shyam is trying to draw our attention to this book. Because of this speed with which things have been done and have been put together, there could be, let's say, some kind of, let's say, compression, little bit of more organization lacking. But otherwise, it could be a source book for anyone who is to be informed about the state of affairs in India, at least of the situation that has been there for the last 3, 4, 5 years. Thank you very much for the opportunity to release this book. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Now I would go to Professor Praveen to start this panel discussion and also invite Professor Shyam Sundar to give his opening remarks for the discussion of his book. Praveen, sir, over to you. Your opening remarks also, please.
Thank you, Arjun. Thank you, IMPRI, for organizing this extremely important event on COVID pandemic and labor rights based on Professor Shyam Sundar's very meticulous account, which has been published in the form of a book. So let's hear from Shyam what he has to offer. Already we have got a very good glimpse of it from Professor Reddy's description and sketch of the book. Let's hear from Professor Shyam Sundar now in terms of some particular themes, some ideas which he would like to underscore. Shyam, over to you now, please.
Uh, Thank you, Professor Praveen Jha, sorry, for giving me this opportunity. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Arjun Kumar for organizing this important event in my life, that is the book launch. Shall I say, probably my swan song in my life. And this is an emotional moment for me. I'll try. I thought I would, I have prepared a script which I will read, lest my undue emotions may take over my sense of control. I have dedicated this book to the Indian Society of Labor Economics, which is a premier body in the field of labor economics and industrial relations. Even though it is titled as the Indian Society of Labor Economics, it's not about labor economics. It's about labor studies, I would say. It covers all aspects concerning labor in every possible discipline. It's at once multi and cross-disciplinary forum. And the growth in my professional growth, academic growth, is coterminous to some extent with ISLE. And it has afforded huge opportunities for me, like it has to hundreds of young scholars. So it's a pleasure that I dedicate this, possibly my final book, to the Indian Society of Labor Economics. And I also included a tribute to Professor T.S. Popola, who, along with my guide, Professor Lalit Deshpande, played a very important role in significant ways. Of course, as all of you, or many of you would know, Professor Lalit Deshpande has been my principal father figure in my life. And I had the pleasure of dedicating 3 books in his honor. And of course, I very much desired that this book should be released by Professor D.N. Reddy, who has also been very kind to me in my life, in my academic life, and also in rough times. People like Professor Lalit Deshpande, Professor T.S. Popola, Professor C.S. Venkataratnam, Professor D.N. Reddy, Professor Praveen Jha, and many others, and Professor Alex Sharma, of course, the most dynamic academic entrepreneur India has probably witnessed. They've all been very kind and supportive to me. And it is with an act of gratitude that I have sought to dedicate several of my publications to people who have been very kind to me. And it's indeed an honor for me that Professor D.N. Reddy has agreed kindly to release the book and to say such kind words, which are surely elevating my levels, even presumably the levels that I should aspire in my limited possible life that may be there. But let me come to the book. Professor Reddy has given a detailed description of the book. As he said, the book comprises 4 sections, and I would not get into those because they would be subject matter of discussion. I thought rather I would relate the contents of my book with the ongoing developments. Even as we speak, the possibility of the COVID-induced macro lockdown is threatening us. And Maharashtra, Madhya Pradesh, and various states like Uttar Pradesh have been imposing some kinds of neo-lockdowns, so to say, as a precursor to a possible macro lockdown. It is the elections that is withholding possible macro lockdown. So I would just start saying that COVID-19 pandemic has wrought the worst possible havoc, both on lives and livelihoods of people in all the countries, including India. However, the adverse impact of the pandemic has landed far more severely on the vulnerably placed, informal and the organized workers, people below the poverty line, and thereby exacerbating the inequalities in the economic system. And hence, ILO had strongly recommended a 4-pillar approach as a comprehensive and a balanced approach, arguing for designing policies and measures based on social dialogue to ensure employment generation, income earning opportunities, and social protection and workers' rights, and also support to firms. But the tale of policy making in India during the pandemic does not conform much to the healthy perspective of ILO. And this is what I have argued throughout the book. My book, and in fact, all my writings, if I may claim to say so, are based on the fundamental premise that labor institutions and social dialogue are indispensable for promoting sound labor market and industrial relations policies that would at once protect both employers' and workers' rights and concerns, especially during the crisis-ridden crucial time such as the one we are facing now. Now, the argument of mine has been that the so-called labor market rigidities induced by labor institutions such as trade unions and the so-called tough labor laws are a myth. They did not even protect the organized sector workers during the COVID-19 times. Now, I argue in the labor market governance chapter, which Professor Reddy rightly pointed out is dear to me, had the government consulted the social partners in not only designing a comprehensive policy architecture to provide relief, even life-saving measures, especially to the small enterprises and informal workers, but also in their delivery, had the government and other agencies implemented even a fraction of the conceptually defective labor laws concerning the unorganized and the migrant workers, had the government consulted global organizations like the International Labour Organization and academics in tackling the workers' woes, the firms' dilemmas, the play of pandemic in the lives of these millions of workers would have been better, if even though marginally. When unemployment as per CMI data has been stubbornly hovering around and over 7%, is it not worrying that India does not have a macro level unemployment allowance or insurance scheme even for the workers in the organized sector? That is what I had argued in the article concerning the Social Security Code. During 2007 and 2017, a total of 10,728 workers only availed unemployment benefits under the stringent ESI-covered unemployment scheme, which means an average claim of 978 workers per year. This is incredibly a very low number, given that we have organized sector employment between 28 and 30 million. Will we see a repeat of poor labor market governance witnessed during COVID-1? I call COVID-1, which means 2020. Such a question arises because we are witnessing inordinate delay in taking the corrective measures, such as creating a comprehensive database concerning the migrant and the unorganized workers, and framing of policies and creating governance mechanisms. The draft migration policy was released just recently by the Niti Aayog, and the Labour Bureau is set to launch 5 employment surveys, which is again conceptually quite poorly conceived. It seeks to cover migrant and domestic workers, but strangely leaves out workers in the emerging sectors like the gig and the platform economy, informal professional service providers. In fact, we do not have employment database pertaining to the service sector. The ASI gives data relating to the manufacturing sector, a very sturdy, stubborn database. And we have the informal sector data, which is derived through various methods. We do not have database on the service sector actually. Though these are all welcome measures, there is no credible gestation plan for implementation of these surveys and the policies. The whole tragic story of workers' rights is the shoddy or non-implementation of even the meagerly legislated rights. A comprehensive database concerning work and employment is essential for devising universal social protection, which would help better implementation of the 4 labor codes. When 68.4% of workers in the non-agriculture sector work in the informal sector, about 70% of them did not have written contracts. More than half of them did not have paid leave, and any form of social security, according to PLFS 2018-19 survey. It causes a grave concern to conscientious academics like many of us, given the extreme precarity of workforce in the non-agriculture sector, which is unlikely to have reduced by 2021. In fact, the precarity would have intensified thanks to COVID-19. The resurgence of COVID-2 poses serious and grave concerns for workers in particular and society and economy in general. More worryingly, the pandemic period witnessed undue haste in the enactment of the 3 labor codes and the passage of several unilateral and highly questionable legal measures and unveiling of structural reforms like privatization and FDI easing measures. How are they called pandemic relieving measures? I fail to understand. Worse still, the lessons of the pandemic disasters have not led to the formation and implementation of governance reforms concerning the delivery of legally mandated relief to the migrant and the construction workers. We are witnessing COVID resurgence, and the hurt-shy migrant workers have already begun their second wave of reverse migration in UP, Maharashtra, and other states. In the absence of macro unemployment benefit or insurance scheme and social security and social protection floor, the legislation or the enactment of the 4 labor codes appear to me nothing but sham exercise. The lack of social dialogue, absence of federal dialogue, the government could have organized the labor ministers' conference or appropriate federal consultations to have the rules framed under the 4 labor codes to kickstart the implementation of the 4 labor codes for which the central government strongly said that it would be implemented from April 1st, 2021. Now we see that this is not going to happen for the next 4 to 6 months because very few states have framed rules under the 4 codes. I fail to understand why the government has not used extensive legal expertise that is available in various national law universities and also the retired, very distinguished bureaucrats who have served in the labor ministry, and also the consult ILO for technical support. I did research on Chinese labor law reforms, particularly the labor contract law. I visited Beijing, and I was really surprised that even the Chinese government extensively consulted the ILO office in China to draft the labor contract law and various other industrial relation laws. The lessons of COVID-1 strongly call for abdication of fiscal conservatism and frame a comprehensive and durable social assistance comprising direct benefit transfer, as economists across spectrum and trade unions have been urging the government to extend urban employment guarantee scheme, at least during the COVID-19 period, and strengthening of MG Narega scheme. But the Union Budget 2021 has not addressed these concerns. Lives and livelihoods are at risk once again, And this time around, the government must be wise, as must be the people, lest the damage to both economic and social fabric of India will be very severe. And the optimistic growth rates that have been predicted not only by the government, the Reserve Bank of India, and the International Monetary Fund should be seen as signals to the foreign direct investors, but they are mirage unless we take these labor market governance measures far more seriously. Employment and work are the surest cures to both unemployment and poverty, which are sure to haunt the people during COVID too. However, I'm an undying optimist. I feel strongly that the Indian democracy is sturdier and its pluralistic approach is still dynamic, and it is with hope I see distinct possibilities of corrective actions both inside the parliament and assemblies and outside. It is important that workers feel safe, and that involves more than gestures and applauses and garlands, and indirect actions like infusing liquidity in the economy through monetary policy, and of course providing the so-called collateral-free and low-interest loans to people to become entrepreneurs and to street vendors. What the government should come out now in the COVID-2 period is strong, sensible policy measures drafted through the mechanism of social and political dialogue. Thank you very much. And before I conclude, I wish to thank once again IMPRI for organizing the event. I thank Professor Praveen Jha for agreeing to moderate this session. And I thank Professor Babu Matthew, Professor Radhika Kapoor, and Ms. Ramapriya Gopalakrishnan to agree to be the panelists. And once again, I thank with tremendous sense of gratitude to Professor D.N. Reddy for releasing the book and saying such kind words. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shyam Sundar. Now we move on to the next stage in our program, which is responding to the book by our distinguished panelists. We start with Professor Babu Matthew. Professor Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Praveen. And at the outset, I must congratulate Professor Shyam Sundar for coming out with a marvelous book, which is so timely and therefore extremely important among all of us who work on labor issues. And of course, important for the whole country if you look at it from a more substantial point of view. It's a very unique book, Professor, and it builds many valuable bridges, and it evokes very valuable memories. Professor D.N. Reddy has already covered the book in such an excellent manner. It creates a little bit of doubt as to what is left for us panelists to do. While sustaining that doubt, let me, however, proceed. Like Professor Reddy said, I think we must take note of the fact that the book is dedicated to the Indian Society of Labor Economics. That itself is something which we must take home. And I must say that it brings back for me my student days, because the Indian Law Institute had produced cases and materials on labor relations. And it was Professor V.B. Singh who contributed the best material to that volume. And Professor Shyam Sundar remembers Professor V.B. Singh and points out how V.B. Singh worked very closely with former President of India, V.V. Giri, and drawing attention to V.V. Giri's methods of intervention in labor matters and his love for collective bargaining. And I think that is also something which acts as a bridge. So when I say a bridge, I mean, the elder generation, the founding generation of labor economists, and now Professor Shyam Sundar has clarified, it was not just labor economics, but labor studies. So a bridge between that generation and the new scholars. There are not many new scholars, I think, unfortunately, but there is a new young group like Ramapriya, who is on this panel, and many others who are slowly emerging and beginning to fight. And this bridge, therefore, will be particularly useful. During my student days, I had opportunity to listen to Professor T.S. Pabola also. And the fact that Professor Shyam begins with a tribute to him is again part of this bridge building process. Perhaps this is the first important major book that links up COVID-19 and the world of work and life, as Professor Shyam says. It is now clear that it is the marginalized among the workforce that are the worst victims of the pandemic. And Professor Shyam draws attention to this reality by contrasting the dual nature of the current labor reform. On the one hand, I don't think there is anything more that capital would like in terms of reform. And on the other hand, the situation of workers is tragically very bad. Professor Shyam Sundar's style of writing is also very unique, strongly rooted in ground reality, which he captures in multiple ways. The use of evidence-based approach for policy considerations. I want to use one example in order to convey why I say this. And that is, he points out in a particular chapter of his book that out of 45 million establishments, 98.34 employ less than 10 workers. I was not aware of these figures in this form, and it is striking because immediately what attracts our attention is to look at the Social Security Code. And as Professor Shyam does, he's drawing attention to the importance of EPF and ESI. And if you look at these two, those are the social security laws of some serious nature that's available in India. I am tempted to call them, put them into the first class category. Of course, when it comes to implementation, there are huge snags, but that apart, there is a second class category of social security measures. And that is very deliberately set aside and reserved for the informal sector. And so when you look at these statistics, which Professor Shyam is pointing out, then it's very clear that the ESI and the EPF is not available to this 98.34% of establishments in India. The definition of establishments is summarized in the schedule to the Social Security Act. And if you look at it, you'll see that the vast majority of workers are excluded from the best of social security measures. I think this kind of evidence-based analysis of reality is a bridge between labor jurisprudence and the political economy of development. And that's extremely valuable, especially in order to overcome the poverty of interdisciplinary approach in this field. I think that is rather rare to find the interdisciplinary approach. And Professor Shyam Sundar certainly brings that richness to the field. He also draws our attention to the Union Finance Minister's announcement that 24% subsidy will be given in respect of the employees' provident fund. It's a subsidy meant to cover employers as well as employees. And that is reserved for establishments with less than 100 workers. EPF applies only to establishments with more than 20 workers. So what is the meaning of this great subsidy that is announced, given the fact that Professor Shyam Sundar's 98.34% figures that we already looked at? This is, there is a tradition in India of populist legislation. And I suppose populist policy pronouncements also don't lie far behind. Professor Shyam Sundar points out how the best of labor laws applies only to 8 to 9%, and how more than 400 million in the informal sector are pushed into second-class treatment. Professor is examining not only the 4 new codes, but also the various amendments to labor laws, which were hastily brought in by many state governments like Rajasthan and Haryana and Assam and Jharkhand, and even Karnataka joined into that race in such a, what shall we say, unprofessional manner that they have to abandon it midway because it's not even legally sustainable. When the matter was challenged in the High Court, quickly the Advocate General, withdrew from the commitment of the government with their own amendments. We have seen this happening in different ways, and I think Professor Shyam Sundar rightly focuses on the use of the threshold in order to deprive substantial rights, Chapter 5B especially. So we must ask the question, why is this happening? Why such a major change? I suppose earlier on, capitalism of the social democratic variety was superimposed on feudalism. But now it is feudalism that is being superimposed on monopoly capital or on crony capitalism. I may take the liberty of saying that this has already had its impact on the nature of the state itself. Professor Shyam Sundar also draws attention to the popular use of the expression ease of doing business. Almost every labor change seems to be, in order to facilitate that phenomenon. But interestingly, if you look at the parameters laid down by the World Bank itself, then it's interesting to see the discrepancy. 6 parameters which initially the World Bank used, I want to mention. The first one is enforcing contracts. The second one is resolving insolvency. The third one is starting a business. The fourth one is registering property. The fifth one is paying tax. The sixth one is trading across borders. We expand it later on. It takes too much time to read it all out. But the crux of it is not one of them refers to labor reforms. So where do our fellows get it from? How do they invent this? It's a category which is not coming from where it originated. And I am happy to note Professor Shyam Sundar at page 80 of his book, he points out that the Industrial Relations Code will neither promote ease of doing business nor serve workers' welfare. It will fail to create conducive and efficient industrial relations environment. It's a very happy thing to note, and I wish this aspect becomes more and more popular in the wider world. When Professor is demonstrating the threshold question, he takes some time to point out how the old Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act, those who are not familiar, it is the requirement that you must take permission from the government before layoff, retrenchment, or closure. And that was challenged, as we know, by the employers before the Supreme Court. And in the first instance, the Supreme Court struck it down. And the government of that day, they took note of what were the defects in the law and reenacted the law once more, curing the old law of all its defects. And it went back to the Supreme Court, which upheld the law. And I think the ease with which this aspect is being done away with is a very sad thing. It is to be noted that the importance of this aspect of labor law becomes all the more pertinent during the context of the non-performing assets. The Reserve Bank of India at one point of time was constrained to say that sickness in India is a profitable business. So it is in that context that Chapter 5A and 5B came. Has that context changed? Even now we know what utter crisis has resulted in the banking sector as a result of this form of misuse of industrial capital. And now, therefore, then you conveniently say that the law will apply only to those units which employ more than 300. I would request Professor Shyam to tell us, what does this mean? What is this universe which will now be covered? So there's hypocrisy. You actually don't like the idea that is contained in 5B, but you pretend as if, you don't mind it, and then tackle it through the method of invoking the threshold. Well, the same thing is done in respect of standing orders, and Professor Shyam Sundar mentions that. And it's such an important part of maintaining good conditions of service on the shop floor. And there again from 100 to 300. Earlier, please note that this applicability in terms of strength was left to the state government. I know in Karnataka, any establishment with more than 50 workers is covered. In Chhattisgarh, I'm told, any establishment with more than 30 workers is covered. And yet that has been, raised to the level of 300. It's also important to note that while threshold is one method of excluding workers from being covered, the other method is the use of definitions. It's a farce to say that this law is meant for simplification. The definitional conflicts that it is going to raise and the confusion that will happen at the time of interpretation. It's not even easy for experts to decipher what is the law. But I must certainly point out that if you are looking at the Social Security Code, then it is through the use of definitions. Definitions now say that if you are an employee, you will get all the best of Social Security. And if you are a worker, worker is not defined, but many other subtypes of workers are defined. So if you are one of the subtypes of workers, then no proper Social Security for you. You will have to go in search of what the central government or the state government may announce as welfare schemes. And if you look at the relevant section as to where the funding will come from, it is, hardly any source of funding. Especially we know the state of the state governments now. And in that context, if you are looking at, the occupational safety code, there again you see how what is available is being murdered. We are almost on the verge of losing the statutory protection for 8 hours of work. That was almost being done away with. I think, as Professor Shyam Sundar points out, that's the occasion when the Director General of the ILO writes to the Prime Minister. And post that intervention, I think 8 hours has remained on the statute book. But there are other ways in which great harm is being done. Even when Social Security does not cost the central government anything. like the cess in the case of construction workers. Thanks to the, effective lobbying also by the construction workers, they were able to partially save that law. But see the cleverness of the aggregators in the gig and platform sector. It is my speculation, my reading, that if you have introduced a cess-based welfare system for the cess and platform workers, if you look at the sequence in which the legislation has been drafted, you can see through it. The aggregators are the ones who have asked the central government to introduce a cess on themselves, ranging from 1 to 2%. And therefore, in anxiety, they say, however, it should not exceed 5% of what we are paying. So there's an aggregator who wants that to be done. And what is the real motivation of these aggregators? The motivation comes through, if you look at the definition of gig worker and platform worker, it includes this phraseology. Platform work means an arrangement outside of a traditional employer-employee relationship. That's what the gig sector wants. They don't want to treat their employees as workers. They want to call them partners. You know that a similar effort of this nature has been going on across the world. And we are happy to note that in the United Kingdom, the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, 7 judges unanimously held that gig workers are workers and that employers cannot get away by refusing to pay them the minimum of social security. So that is, this is advanced attempt to preempt coverage of the Indian gig worker under labor law. I finally want to just mention how Professor Shyam is drawing attention to the end of tripartitism. Despite ILO Convention 144 ratified by India, a neutral government must listen to capital and labor. But now we have a partisan government which listens to only one side, and that is to crony capitalism. And Professor Shyam calls this as neo-unilateralism. I think that is something which we must popularize. I use the expression neo-constitutionalism in my classroom, and so I understand this phraseology. And I think everything that industry wanted has been given to them, and the globally recognized minimum standards for labor has been denied. I congratulate Professor Shyam once more, and I hope this book is read and debated widely. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Matthew, for these very pertinent remarks on some aspects of what Professor Shyam Sundar has covered in his book and adding to some of these issues. May I now invite Dr. Radhika Kapoor, please. Radhika, floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Jha, and thank you, IMPRI, for inviting me for this event. Let me begin by congratulating Professor Shyam Sundar on this excellent volume. The last 1 year has seen a dramatic change in the landscape, the labor law landscape in India, starting, not just the introduction of the 4 codes by the central government, but also the various relaxations and the amendments which were made by state governments post the announcement of the lockdown, ostensibly with the objective of attracting investment. There have been just so many changes that I think keeping track of all of them as someone who's interested in labor laws and their implications for employment creation and industrial performance is really a challenge. So I'm immensely grateful to Professor Shyam Sundar to have simplified that task for us. And I genuinely think that this book is going to be a treasure trove for scholars in the years to come, when we need to sit back and reflect on all the changes that happened in the labor law landscape in 2020. I must also commend the lucid style of writing. As an economist who has no legal background, but is trying to understand the impact of labor laws on economic issues, I think Professor Shyam Sundar's writings are my go-to reference, because he's able to explain the various nuances, decode the complexities in this enormous regulatory maze of labor laws, that I must congratulate him and thank him also for simplifying that task for researchers like myself. The book is, of course, very exhaustive and very detailed, and I don't want to repeat much of what is in the book, but I just want to highlight a few points that were particularly striking and some questions that I had that hopefully we can hear from Professor Shyam Sundar. So the first point I want to make is something which all the speakers before have already highlighted, but I think it's worth reiterating in the current context, because over the last year it has become more apparent than ever before how woefully inadequate India's social security architecture is in protecting informal workers. And we have witnessed unheard of distress amongst informal workers. We witnessed the exodus of migrant laborers who walked hundreds of kilometers when they have just lost their jobs overnight because they didn't have any sort of written contracts. There was no security of tenure. There were casual employment relationships. And as Professor Shyam Sundar points out that, though this architecture is unable to protect, doesn't provide much protection to unorganized sector workers, but even in instances where there is some level of protection that is available, for instance, in the case of construction workers, where you have the BOCW and where under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, there was a provision that was made for providing direct benefit transfers to construction workers that actually didn't go through and fructify because the institutional mechanism was so weak, be it in terms of registering the workers or the implementation issues that we faced. So on net, the situation was a complete disaster in terms of reaching out to informal sector workers. Now, one would have imagined that having dealt with a crisis of such nature, a key learning for us would have been that we need to build stronger safety nets in a post-pandemic world. And the Social Security Code is naturally, one would have expected would be the key instrument to achieve that stronger social safety net. But as he points out in his writings, the Social Security Code really leaves so much to be desired. Instead of creating a universal social protection floor, it again goes in for a very fragmented approach. There are no concrete schemes that are laid out. There is no clarity on how this social security is going to be funded, which is actually a very complex and difficult question that needs to be front and center in the social security code debate, because you have such a complex set of employer-employee relationships in India with, over half of your workforce being self-employed, another 25% being in casual work where they don't have one single employer, but they're working across multiple employers. How do you actually ensure some sort of contribution, or should it be a non-contributory scheme, given that many of these casual workers actually don't make enough to make any sort of contribution? So these are questions that should have been front and center in the Social Security Code, but sadly they are missing from that discourse, and the code completely shies away from providing any universal social protection floor. In fact, as Professor Shyam Sundar points out, what we're really seeing is the Unorganized Workers Act of 2008 being subsumed under this code, and we all know how effective that was. So clearly there is no progress happening on this front, which is really deeply disappointing given the nature of the crisis we have witnessed over the last year. The second issue that I want to raise, which I found very interesting, is actually very dear to my heart, is he has a chapter on how labor laws in India have a threshold-based approach. And he draws the origins of this threshold-based approach to the British government, where he mentions that, different versions of the Factories Act, which was started in 1881, they talked about how the act would apply to factories which were using mechanical power and employs not less than 100 persons. This was then revised to 50 workers in 1891, and later in 1922 to 20 workers. And it's ironic that even 70 years after independence, these new labor codes that we're talking about, barring the minimum wage code, you don't have a universal approach, and they continue to follow this threshold-based approach. In fact, even the minimum wage code, though it is universal in nature and applies to all unorganized sector workers, it's fraught with implementation challenges, and it's not really clear how minimum wages are going to be enforced in the unorganized sector where there are no written contracts. But broadly, we are continuing with this threshold-based approach in all the other three codes. And in fact, if one actually looks at the sort of discussion that we have had around labor laws for the last 5-6 years, that entire discussion on what we call labor reform has focused on tinkering with these thresholds, starting from the time when Rajasthan increased the threshold for the Industrial Disputes Act from 100 to 300 workers in 2014, followed by states like Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra. And the argument for increasing the threshold has always been that having these thresholds in place disincentivizes firms' growth. But it's not clear to me, even as an economist who plays around a lot with this ASI data, if there is indeed bunching, which is happening at this threshold of 100 workers, if you increase the threshold, essentially the perverse disincentive for expanding now just moves up the ladder, but you're still inhibiting firms from growing to the optimal size that they want to. So the threshold-based approach really needs a radical rethink, more so now, because if we look at the ILO's centenary declaration, it talks about the idea of a universal labor guarantee, which basically says that you have to protect the fundamental rights of workers, ensure adequate living wages, limits on hours of work, and safe and healthy workplaces to all workers, regardless of the size of the enterprise. And I think that is the goal that we should be trying to achieve. And this was also the idea which was actually laid out by the National Commission for Enterprises in the unorganized sector. But though this is a laudable objective, how are we going to go about achieving it is something which again merits great attention, because as the statistics in Professor Shyam Sundar's book point out, the enterprise landscape in India is essentially dominated by a very large number of micro and small enterprises, which are informal in nature. And for these firms to bear the costs of providing social security to their worker or ensuring the necessary safety and health standards is far too difficult. So if we have to try and provide this universal labor guarantee, the cost of that is likely to be very onerous for the micro and small enterprises. And this then leads to the question of, if creating these good, what we call good, decent jobs is our objective, then who has to bear the cost of creating these jobs? Now, having these good jobs is actually a positive externality for society. But to assume that the private sector and the firms are going to internalize that externality and bear the entire cost of creating those good jobs might be a bit presumptuous. And here I think we need to think about what role the state can play in contributing and bearing a part of the cost in creating those good jobs, be it in terms of some sort of subsidies or active labor market policies. Because at the end of the day, these good, well-paying, decent jobs are a positive social externality. My third point then relates to, we're talking about this idea of a good job and we're talking what's decent work. And to all of us who are on this panel, the idea of a good job would really be, a well-paying job that allows you to afford a decent standard of living, which gives you some security of tenure, hopefully some permanency. But if you actually look at the data that is there from, be it from the PLFS or the NSS surveys before that, what you find is that these permanent good jobs are really far. There are very, very few of them. I computed this one statistic for 2018-19, and I can tell you that the percentage of regular wage salaried workers who had access to all available social security benefits that the data captured and had written contracts which were of more than 3 years was a little over 2% of the workforce. This statistic is for 2018-19. And when I computed the same statistic using the NSS 2011-12 and 2004-5 data, the statistic was just a little over 3%, which means that even in this period when India witnessed unprecedented economic growth, our ability to create these good, well-paying, decent jobs was dismal. And here I'm a little bit pessimistic because I now wonder whether the idea of a good job is going to be linked to some element of permanency, the Industrial Relations Code has now introduced the idea of fixed-term employment, which I welcome in principle, though as Professor Shyam Sundar has pointed out, and I've written about it as well, that there are various gaps in the way fixed-term employment has been introduced in India. But to my mind, it actually seems that the idea of formal employment in India might now be based on fixed-term employment, not permanent jobs. And though I agree that fixed-term employment is worse than a permanent job, but I think it's still better than having contract work. So therefore, going forward, it's also important that we close the legal loopholes, which are disincentivizing firms from hiring fixed-term workers and instead going for use of contract workers, which there actually is a provision in the Code on Occupational Safety and Health, where they say that contract workers can be used even for core work in exceptional circumstances. So I think, and Professor Shyam Sundar has mentioned, 3-4 points and how we need to strengthen the fixed-term employment system, be it in terms of introducing caps on the number of renewals, what is the maximum duration of the terms of employment and so on. But I feel that maybe going ahead, that is what is going to be the idea of formality in the labor market, not just in India, but perhaps globally as well. My final point is actually has already been raised by Professor Babu Matthew, but I will say it again repeatedly, is how we are playing around with these definitions of workers and employees simply to deprive people of social security entitlements. For instance, Professor Shyam Sundar has also written about Asha and Anganwadi workers. Now, these workers are actually classified, we are using the word worker, but they're actually called volunteers, and they are paid an honorarium. They don't get minimum wages. They are not entitled to any social security. And over the last year, we've actually seen what an important role they've played as frontline workers. And to deprive these people of basic amenities is actually, very, very upsetting. That's one point. And the second kind of workers where, I think we need to think a bit more about is, again, this idea of gig workers. We've all been lauding and celebrating the fact that the Social Security Code mentions gig workers and talks about providing them social security. But what is this concept of a gig worker? I think the definition, as Professor Babu Matthew mentioned, is not unambiguous. And again, this is not something which is just in the case of India. As he mentioned, we are globally seeing this phenomena where gig workers, which are traditionally classified as independent contractors and fall in the category of self-employed. They are not actually these independent contractors, but they are essentially working as employees, but they have been mislabeled just because the firm doesn't want to pay for their social security cover. And there's a ruling that happened recently in the UK where they said that Uber drivers were in fact employees. There is the AB5 law, which was passed in the state of California, which again said that, they laid out a three-pronged strategy where they said these are the three criteria that would have to be satisfied if a person is actually an independent contractor or a worker, depending on, how closely his work was monitored by the platform, if he was free to do other things and so on and so forth. So, the idea of gig work may well become increasingly important in the years to come. So having greater clarity on who these workers are and how we can ensure that, employees are not being misclassified as these independent contractors to deprive them of social security entitlements is very important. And finally, let me conclude by saying that as an economist, I was particularly delighted to see the section on statistics in this book. In fact, on gig work itself, we hear so many tall claims in India about how the gig economy is going to create 1 million jobs. But having worked across multiple data sets, I can tell you that there is no way for us to capture what a gig worker is. In fact, even these ideas of fixed-term employment is something we're not being able to capture in the data. Our household surveys have basically 3 broad groups in which they classify workers. You're either self-employed or you're casual or regular salaried workers. And while I'm not proposing that we change those classifications because those are in line with international norms and we need them for comparability purposes, but we do need to do a greater deep dive into, what is the nature of work, what is the nature of the contract within each of these categories to understand how employer-employee relationships are evolving in India. And this is important not just because of issues of flexibility and inflexibility, which have dominated the narrative here, but also because the nature of the contract has very important implications for the accumulation of firm-specific human capital by the worker, and in turn on the firm productivity. And even here, the ASI data, which is very solid, comprehensive industrial data, falls short because it uses just two broad groups of production workers, either directly employed or contract. It doesn't tell you in any detail anything about what happens within this category of directly hired workers. So I was very happy to see that, because eventually for us to empirically understand the impact of these labor laws, the introduction of these various new categories, we need to be able to capture that in the data. So with that, let me conclude, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Radhika, for your extremely insightful and pertinent remarks in general relating to the world of work in India, and some very important aspects covered by Shyam Sundar's book. May I now invite Rama, floor is yours. Ramapriya Gopalakrishnan, who she has already been introduced, is a leading labor advocate and a very close friend of labor, so to say. Rama, please.
Thank you, Professor Praveen Shah. Good evening, everybody. Am I audible clearly? Okay. So good evening, everybody. I'm very happy to be invited to speak on the launch of Professor Shyam Sundar's book, Impact of COVID-19 Reforms and Poor Governance on Labor Rights in India. Over the last 1 year, as we all know, there has been an onslaught on labor rights. Ever since the nationwide lockdown was imposed, there's been a sea change in the labor law landscape of the country, with various state governments announcing changes to the labor laws, which are principally of 4 kinds. Exempting industries, particularly new industries, from the application of labor laws. Then exempting industries from labor inspection. Some states have brought such reforms. Then increasing the hours of work and increasing the number thresholds under different labor laws. So using the cover of COVID-19, state governments first embarked on this exercise. And then in September 2020, the 2 houses of parliament passed 3 of the labor codes, the Industrial Relations Code and the Social Security Code and the Code on Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions. The 4th code, the Code on Wages, was earlier passed in the year 2019. Now, what are the changes that have been brought about in the labor laws over the last couple of years? What are the shortcomings of the new laws? What are the implications of these new laws for workers? All these issues have been covered in the various articles which have been collated in this book. This book is a collection of 37 articles that Professor Shyam Sundar has written in 2020 in the new normal world after the imposition of the nationwide lockdown. These are articles which have been published in the Deccan Herald, the Business Line, the Financial Express, Business Manager, Leaflet, Wire, and so on. One of the articles on the Code of Wages that dates back to 2019. And then there are also 3 interviews with Professor Shyam Sundar, one of which was published in the Down to Earth, one in the Live Mint, and the other, I think, is in Financial Express. There are 3 interviews as well. And each of these is a gem. As Professor Babu Matthew pointed out, each article of Professor Shyam Sundar is informed by a sound understanding of the law. I think of him as a quasi-labor lawyer, not a labor lawyer by qualification, but his understanding of law is as good as labor lawyers. And at the same time, he also brings in the critical analysis of an economist. So each article is informed by a sound understanding of the law, as well as a thorough analysis of the available data. And in each of the articles, he also makes very useful recommendations. And one example, like for me, the article which first struck my eye because I'm a labor lawyer was chapter 21. Chapter 21 is titled The Reform of Settlement of Industrial Disputes in the Industrial Relations Code. the scheme and some critical reflections. Again, this reflects a sound understanding of the system of industrial dispute resolution. And at the same time, he has meticulously covered the various available statistical data on the pendency of labor cases in the High Court and the Supreme Court, the pendency of cases before the labor courts, then data about conciliation and so on. And then he has made very useful recommendations in the concluding part of the chapter. So each chapter is written in a similar vein, and the book is very comprehensive. It covers various subjects, all of which are subjects on which Professor Shyam Sundar has been writing for years. Labor reforms, the labor market, the industrial relations system, labor administration, labor inspection, and the lack of labor statistics that has been highlighted. And he makes an impassioned plea. He had mentioned that he has made an impassioned plea for social dialogue, not only for social dialogue, for decent jobs, for coverage of all workers in the country under the labor laws, for compliance with international labor standards, for unemployment benefits. He makes an impassioned plea for all of this in his book. And each article is a gem. Each article, and this is the second such collection. 2 years ago, I had participated in the function for the launch of his earlier book on the labor law reforms. At that time, the codes were just in the bill forms. And there again, there was a collection of his earlier articles. So I look at this volume as part 2, or a continuum of his earlier volume, which is also a collection of his various articles on labor law reforms. And this is part 2 of that. And with these 2 parts, any reader will get a sound understanding of the entire labor law reform process, the background to the reforms, the earlier versions of the bills, the codes that have been passed, and then the shortcomings in the codes, their implications. And this book, it will definitely enrich the library of anyone interested in the area of research on the labor law reforms and their implications for the workers. I commend Synergy Books India for bringing out this book, and also Professor Shyam Sundar for his excellent writings. And Professor Shyam Sundar had said that this is perhaps his swan song. I'm sure none of us would want that. We want you to keep writing, sir, because you're making such an important contribution to the world. You should keep writing. Thank you.
Praveen, sir. Professor Praveen Jha, are you there? Okay. Nevertheless, Professor Shyam Sundar, would you like to respond to the comments made?
Hello.
Yes, yes, please. I have written down the questions, but if you want to respond, you can go ahead, and then I can come to the.
No, I just want to thank all the panelists, of course, Professor Reddy also, first Professor Reddy and the panelists. I mean, Professor Jha is here. So Professor Praveen Jha, would you like to say, then I will, after the QA, I'll come in.
It might be a good idea, I guess, first to maybe have a Q&A, and then
I would like, maybe I would like to hear your views also, because you're not just a moderator, but I mean, as good as much more than a panelist.
Sir, I'm collecting the question, no problem.
Okay, okay. Thanks. I mean, you know, I got disconnected for a minute or so, I think. So let me first of all thank Rama as well for her extremely insightful comments. Now, I mean, indeed, this is an excellent contribution by Professor Shyam Sundar for a variety of reasons, as has been pointed out by all the preceding speakers, panelists. That Shyam has a fantastic eye for details. It's extremely grounded in terms of fine-grained account of the whole range of issues which he has covered, and he blends that with very, very careful analysis. Now, this is a remarkable kind of achievement. And indeed, the range of issues which he has covered in this book, again, which has been pointed out by preceding speakers, being super active in 2020, covering a whole range of themes, etc. I mean, sort of, it's absolutely astounding what he has achieved. And this book, at least to me, is a kind of a, must read for all those who are interested in the world of work in the era of COVID in particular, but generally speaking, the whole landscape of laws, whole range of issues relating to livelihoods, the challenges there, etc., workers' rights, industrial relations. It's a fantastic kind of bouquet, and I am extremely happy to recommend it as I said, a book which should be very much on everyone's shelf who wants to engage with these issues. So thank you, Shyam, for putting this together. Thank you.
Right. So let me quickly go through some of the questions which have come on Zoom. Facebook, there is not much question. Many congratulations have come to you, sir. First question is from Dr. Muthuraja Chinnasamy, sir. Since COVID is continuously disturbing, damaging the livelihood, labor, rural and economy in the name of COVID-1, now COVID-2 plus, what kind of public policy will help to protect people and social security, especially to the labor? Then we have Dr. Bamadev Sigdal, sir. Professor Sundar, namaste. Book is very comprehensive and pertinent indeed. I hope you have mentioned migrant worker socioeconomic status in post-COVID era in book. As more Nepali and rural Indian workers were affected by COVID in formal and informal sector in India, what was the response of the central and federal governments at policy level? Could you mention it to benefit also from Nepal's perspective? Ishika Chaudhary, she's a student at Lady Shri Ram College. She's asking whether the time has come for a universal basic income in India and whether it can be an effective solution, looking especially from the labor point of view. She's also asking that when we talk about employment, I'm really worried by increasing regionalism in employment. For instance, Haryana recently reserved seats for its local people in private sector. Do you think reservation is an effective way for governments to ensure local people are employed? Again, a question of that, merit versus reservation and what our laws are doing. Recent data also shows that women has been adversely affected by COVID-19 and have lost more jobs than men. Due to unpaid care work at home, women find it difficult to manage, especially in the scenario of work from home. What can we as a part of civil society do in this regard, and what can be done by the government? Then we have Anohita Mojumdar asking if the new laws are against international standards and India's commitment, it is not possible to challenge them legally in the courts. So that is one very legal question. I think our panelists can also ask. I would also like to ask and add on the policy and what effectively we can do. So we had Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana as a support, then it came as Atmanirbhar package. So basically we are giving PDS, and then there was support of 500 to Women Jan Dhan account. So that has been, our, and some support also came from PM Care for migrant workers. And when we talk to our other experts also, and now since we are in this second wave, so what do you think will be more effective? Because many of our experts towards our budget have also said, and Professor Santosh Mehrotra was making a case that what we have, PM Kisan, where we are sending 6,000 per annum, whether to extend also to urban areas. How do you see that can be happening? Or Azim Premji University has also done many surveys and also has done calculation. Dr. Amit Basole also highlight that if we extend or give urban social security or income support, it will yield to around 50-60,000 crores. So do you think now the time has come, or what the state governments should do in this regard? So these were some of the questions, sir. Please kindly feel free to choose any of them and to respond.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. I mean, first of all, I felt like a person waiting. I mean, an anxious director or an actor whose film is out and is being reviewed by critics. And it's with a huge sense of relief that I sit here responding to the comments and the questions that the panelists, Professor Reddy and the panelists, Professor Babu Matthew, Professor Radhika Kapoor and Ramapriya Gopalakrishnan have been extremely kind to me for giving almost good notices to my book. There are a few issues on which I mean, of course, I largely agree with what they said. And Professor Babu speaking about my work or ISLE being a bridge, constituting a bridge. And of course, he specifically asked about the impact of extending the threshold. I mean, of course, that also figured in Professor Radhika Kapoor's discussion of my book also. There are two ways to include or exclude workers or employees or firms through law. One is by the threshold of applicability, which of course covers either by employees or by wages or by any other age or any other criteria. The point that I was trying to make in the book is that the codes were I mean, the mission of the codes were to eliminate discrimination, complexity, and confusion by multiple definitions and all other issues, and also to extend the ambit of law. But these are the precise failings of the codes. They have used, say, the wage code. In all other codes, multiple thresholds have been used, either at the broad level or when we delve deeper into the code, to exclude many and to provide conflicting definitions. And the very idea of codification itself is questionable according to me, because each Payment of Wages Act has a purpose which is different from Minimum Wages Act. It is different from the Bonus Act. So the definitions ought to vary, but nonetheless, it has been done. So this raising of the threshold or lowering of the threshold, whichever way one looks at, will exclude more number of small-sized establishments, and by the structural logic of size distribution, will affect marginally. Will affect, in a marginal sense, relatively less number of workers, because small-sized establishments would typically employ lesser number of workers. So, as Professor Reddy, I think mentioned the statistic used in my book that 90% of the registered factories in the organized sector, according to ASA data, would stand excluded by the raising of the threshold, either in relation to standing order or by hire and fire, to put it crudely. And of course, 44% of the workers would stand excluded. But the larger question one needs to ask is that, as economic development takes place, as time passes, should the laws not be more inclusive rather than be increasingly exclusive? This is the conundrum that I'm failing to understand. Is it not a part of developmental process that laws should include more workers, provide them more security, laws or firms, either way? So this is a kind of a developmental conundrum that I fail to understand. The second question is about, the statistic about the point about the trade-off between fixed-term employment versus contract labor. This is a classical trade. I mean, the fixed-term employment has not picked up mainly because still it makes economic sense in terms of low-cost labor cost strategy for the employers to go for resorting to the third-party labor contract system rather than engaging workers directly under the fixed-term employment. Though some good employers, good firms might prefer to have engage FTE. But the predominant labor market strategy during the neoliberal era has been through lowering labor cost. So in that sense, contract work labor system would continue to be dominant even as the government is flagging FTE, that is fixed term employment, as a win-win approach. The point, the question that is, I mean, the point that Professor Radhika made, or Professor Babu Matthew made, or Rama made, was that are we going towards the dream of achieving decent jobs? That brings me to the question that India is a signatory to 3 important ILO conventions: Employment Policy Convention C-122, 1964, Tripartite Consultation International Labour Standards Convention 1976, C-144, and Labour Inspection Convention C-81, 1947. India is a signatory to all the 3 conventions. And I'm particularly mentioning, of course, we all know in the public discourses that India has not, even though it has ratified, it has not respected Tripartite Consultation Convention C-144 or Labour Inspection Convention C-81. What is largely missing in the public discourses is the fact that India does not have till date an employment policy. Late Professor T.S. Papola drafted it, and later ILO tried to do some work. We do not have an employment policy, which is the primary purpose of Employment Policy Convention C-122. It requires all the signatory countries to draft and design an active policy to promote full, productive, and freely chosen employment. Till this time, till this time we draft such a policy, it will be well nigh impossible for us to have any sense of direction. So now coming to the question, if there is some problem of video, I do not know. But anyway, I'll go ahead. The question was that what happened? Yeah, fine. I mean, I'll just make a collective point in the sense that the public policy concerning migrant workers was conspicuous by its absence during COVID period. And as I said, the Niti Aayog has drafted the migration policy, which commentators like Professor Ravi Srivastava has lauded, but pointed out several gaps. And I think this is through public consultation that the national migration policy, which the National Commission for Rural Workers in 1992 pointed out the need for a migration policy. In 2021, we have a huge time lag in implementing what various commissions and committees have implemented. It is for those people who are in the public life, the parliamentarians and the social partners to take up, and the academics, of course, to take these issues to a serious level of discussion in the public discourse. It is essential that we should have an employment policy, a migration policy, and a labor policy. As students of industrial relations and labor economics, we used to study the labor policies in various plan documents. Of course, planning has been thrown to the dustbin. We do not have a labor policy in question. So we do not have an employment policy. We do not have a migration policy, though it is in the making. We do not have a labor policy. And these are pillars for creating decent and good jobs. And of course, we need a comprehensive labor statistical system to which economists like Professor Radhika Kapoor will be contributing, I'm sure. And the universal basic income is something that has been debated about. And of course, one of the economic survey documents also spoke of it. And Professor Guy Standing has been advocating it. And it has its merits. And that is what I meant when I said the universal basic income in terms of minimum social protection floor or direct benefit transfer, targeted direct benefit transfer, and urban employment scheme. These are the various components by various mechanisms by which UBI could be achieved. Of course, there are always knee-jerk reactions, populist measures, as Professor Babu Matthew spoke of. There is a job reservation for locals, and I have written in a couple of articles, and they are in the book. This is a very short-sighted approach, and this is simply a knee-jerk response. And it is a populist measure, and it is to hoodwink the public and the work and the firms. And I mean, the firms are not unduly worried, by the way, and the workers and the political constituency. It is for the political constituencies, and it's a political strategy. And of course, the challenge is that what should we do with this deficient labor codes? Can we go for repeal, like the farmers are asking, demanding repeal of the 3 laws which are hurting the farmers' interests? Repeal may not be possible, but the political dialogue must go on, the social dialogue must go on, and in the forthcoming parliamentary sessions and others, even if the parliamentary standing committee recommendations for the different codes are implemented as amendments to the existing codes, they will go a long way, even though marginal, in promoting a balanced perspective in terms of providing some kind of stimulus to investment and also to protecting the workers' rights. And of course, yesterday I watched Dr. Geeta Gopinath advocating that it is time to revive the social protection policy, which was discontinued in December or sometime October to December time. And that is very important. So there is a need for some kind of a direct benefit transfer, be they be Jandan or by Kisan Yojana or Kalyan Yojana, whatever may be the mechanism. There is a dire need for DBT, and there is an express need for UBI for the workers, so that they would be able to withstand the possible difficulties and even woes that might stare at them in COVID-2 time. So with this, of course, I conclude. But I want to, before I guess this is my last go, and I may not have another chance to come. I just want to make a personal statement, since I said that this is possibly my swan song. Of course, I will leave it to the divine invisible hand. If I had to write, I would have to write. If I feel compelling to write, I would write. But at this juncture, this is what I thought. But I would take this opportunity to thank all my teachers, particularly Professor Lalit Deshpande, whom I can never ever forget in my life. Professor Lalit Deshpande, Professor T.S. Popola, Professor Venkataratnam, Professor K.P. Chalaswamy, who was my mentor during my college times, postgraduate, undergraduate college times in Chennai, the IAS officer, Mr. Ranganathan, Professor Alex Sharma, who has been extremely kind to me, of course, Professor D.N. Reddy, and many others in the Indian Society of Labor Economics, and of course, friends like Professor Praveen, Ramapriya, Gopalakrishnan, and Professor Madheshwaran, Preet, who passed away. All these people have been very kind to me. It is due to the kindness of these people that I stand where I am. And of course, hailing as I do from a South Indian Vaishnavite Iyengar family, it's a teacher who holds predominant position in our system. Of course, this is not, I'm not making a primordial statement as a kind of a social marker, but this is my cultural identity. So teachers have largely defined my life, and I bow to them. Of course, my family members, my brothers, my sisters, my wife who has been very supportive of my ventures, and my daughter all this, my academic struggles meant that little quality time for my daughter and little quality time to my wife. I've been traveling, and I want to thank, of course, them immensely for being there with me even when I was away. I was with them, but I was away from them. And of course, I had large health issues. And in this sense, I can never ever forget Professor Lalit Deshpande, Dr. Sudha Deshpande. I hope she is there, and their family, for their extreme sense of kindness and generosity. I once again thank all the people in the program for their kindness and for the kind notices to my book. And I leave this platform with the final saying that I'm grateful to whatever that has happened in my life, good or bad. And thanks for being kind to me.
Sir, there is one more question.
Sure.
I said record. Praveen, sir, please go ahead.
No, Arjun, please go ahead.
Okay.
I don't have a question, please.
No, sir, it just came. Professor Uday Shankar from Rajiv Gandhi Law Center at IIT Kharagpur is asking one important question, that too much expectations have been from the central government to bring reforms in the area of labor law since independence. It is be noted that the states are made equally responsible to improve the quality of life of working class under the constitutional scheme. What measures to be undertaken to make the state governments more accountable? And there is also one question by Mr. Arvind Stroti. The all labor codes, especially IR codes, will bring industrial peace or jungle raj. And for ease of doing business, industrial peace is important. But it seems the objective is not industrial peace, but favoring crony capital. We also try to have, because of the Cold War, China-US situation last year, before also, we had red carpet and other things. So would you like to respond to that, Professor Sundar? Or
the codes, in a sense, particularly the Industrial Relations Code, has centralized powers of rule making, and I think the federal structure is in a kind of I won't say peril, is facing challenges. There is also the industry has argued for removing labor from the concurrent list and bring it to the state list, so that the state governments could, in a competitive neoliberal regime, would be able to respond to the market forces as suitable as possible. But thankfully, the central government has not done it. The state governments need a lot of handholding in making these labor codes to be translated into various rules, and so that the codes could be implemented in whatever form they are. So I would advocate that the central government take three measures. Number one, to convene labor ministers' conference, which was institutionalized during the Second World War by the British government. In fact, the Indian Labour Conference, the social dialogue platform, was also institutionalized by the British government. These are the two dialogue fora which have had a glorious history, but now stand ill-used or unused. And at the state level, there is a dire need for the state labor advisory boards, the tripartite dialogue consultation system, to be revived. These are the ways by which there could be effective social and economic policy making. I would not go to the extent of saying that the industrial relations system or the labor market governance is aiding crony capitalism, though it could in many ways. But all I would say is that there is still, being in a pluralistic democratic society, we must harbor optimism, and there could be various ways of correcting the historical blunders, as one would call them, committed in between 2015 and 2020 in the next few years, maybe either by the same party or if there is a change in the political governance. So I'm optimistic that the industrial relations system would revert to the equilibrium position of the classic industrial relations system as it evolved during the command economy, and which paid rich dividends in. Of course, I'm sure that the industrial relations code as it stands now, as I mentioned in the book, and I think Professor Babu Matthew observed correctly, that it would serve the interests of neither employers nor workers. So there is a need to be. I mean, making codes, I thought was a very industrious job, but now I'm very convinced correcting the codes and making it look much more balanced is going to be a Herculean task. And here lies the challenges before academics, the social partners, particularly the industry bodies, and the trade union movement and the working class movement, and of course the political spectrum. So for me, the correcting the historical blunders is a far more industrious and challenging job, and the immediate future appears to me will be a benchmark, will be a very crucial time, COVID notwithstanding, for designing and new policies, as well as providing a sense of balance to the legal regime, and of course to create a very comprehensive labor statistical system, which has been utterly destroyed during the neoliberal period, the post-reform period between 1991 and 2020. And to me, this is a matter of grave concern. How does one make policies and laws without sturdy and comprehensive database? So to me, three things matter now. One, correcting the legislative errors and creating a sense of balance between ease of doing business and labor rights. And secondly, drafting policies, employment policy, labor policy, and migration policy. And thirdly, creating a very sturdy and comprehensive statistical system while conforming to the international norms. And we have the International Labor Statistics. We have, of course, ratified International Labor Statistics Convention of the ILO, and International Labor Statistics Conference also have been taking place, and they provide the worthy guidelines. With these remarks, I would end. And if I have not acknowledged anyone, I deeply beg their pardon. And I thank IMPRI and Indian Social Institute and the Working People's Charter for organizing this function, and of course I'm really thankful. Thanks.
Thank you. Praveen sir, if you allow us and suggest, we can go just for a final thoughts to each of our panelists for like 1 minute.
Yes, I think that's a good idea. Maybe half a minute to a minute each, to starting with Professor Reddy, and we can go in the same order.
Right.
Professor Reddy.
See, the recognition of the work done by Shyam should not put him in a diffidence, and I'm a little bit disturbed to hear from him. Maybe this would be the last work I think there are very few people who have been working continuously on issues of this kind. And I think you don't have to harp any kind of hesitancy in trying to continue your work, which you have heard from all of us, is doing a great deal of help in trying to understand the processes which are moving towards that of increasingly, as you perhaps been telling, right from the days of the neoliberal regimes, it has reached a point where you were completely destroying a system which could be recognized as a fair system of employment and, let's say, labor in the country. Therefore, we need many more people, not people withdrawing from this. I think I would like to, I don't believe in advising in that sense, but I do feel strongly that you do the kind of work you have been doing, which you may not recognize to yourself as a great contribution, but all of us do recognize it's very useful for the country. That's perhaps the note on which I would like to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reddy. Professor Matthew.
Thank you, Professor Praveen. I would also endorse what Professor Reddy has just now said. I don't want Professor Shyam to get into the mode of the swan song. Instead, I must request something proactive. And that is, you look at this forum, you have brought together one more level of interdisciplinary reflection. And I think that is a scarce commodity nowadays. Even when we attempt an interdisciplinary approach, there is always something missing, not only in labor relations field, but in so many other fields that we have seen. So you have, in a sense, laid the substratum for going to the next level of discussion on the same set of issues, including, for example, the federalism concept that you referred to. Very correctly, the tremendous centralization that these 4 codes have attempted. And it is in the Social Security Code that there is the highest centralization of rulemaking power. You search for anything for the appropriate government to do, and there is nothing there. So that is a trend which doesn't correspond with Indian reality in the sense of the rich federal history we have had. And I wait to see what will happen, after the elections in this regard. I subscribe to your view that we must move for amendments. I think there are 2 positions. One is rejectionism. Rejectionism meaning you reject everything in all the 4 codes. In reality, you find that there's a lot of cut and paste. There's a lot of stuff from the old regime. And there are here and there interesting additions. I would seek this recognition of trade unions as a very important new dimension in law. Of course, they are shy to say it must be through the secret ballot. So we welcome the idea of recognition, but we have to push for it to be carried out along the secret ballot method. We welcome the idea that they are talking of a floor wage, but that floor wage cannot be what the labor minister announced, in parliament. It will have to be closer to at least what Ranganathan committee said when he was trying to measure what is, poverty line. And so, we must perhaps subscribe to the idea that the floor wage, I don't want to call it universal minimum wage. It is not intended to be that, because the minimum wage also is sustained and it must continue to be sustained. And so the floor wage must be put into a different category. So in that sense, Professor, please continue to take the initiative to carry out this dialogue more and more in the days to come. I'm sure all of us would be happy to support and join in. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Matthew. Radhika, you want to chip in now, please?
Yes, I just want to request Professor Shyam Sundar to continue writing on these subjects. His ability to bring this interdisciplinary approach to study labor laws in India is something which is truly unique. And I always look forward to his writings to understand what is happening in the labor regulatory framework and what implications this has for the work I do. So please do continue to keep writing. It would be a great loss if we don't have access to your works. And more broadly, I think the point that he's raised about an employment policy is particularly pertinent. And this employment policy really needs to place workers at the center stage. And it's not just about giving them safety nets, some of which we can do through employment guarantee programs, but also putting in place an industrial policy, which again puts these workers at center stage.
Thank you very much, Radhika. Ramapriya.
We all need to keep working to have better labor policies in place and better laws in place. I also endorse the views of Professor Babu Matthew that I don't think rejectionism or rejecting all the new codes is a solution, but working with the codes and seeing how to improve on them may be a solution, and you need to be a part of that exercise and continue to keep raising voice for, as Radhika put it, for keeping workers center stage and for moving away from the paradigm of what you call neo-unilateralism. So we have a lot of work ahead. I mean, all of us labor activists, and I hope you'll continue to be part of the work and to continue writing about all these issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you, all our great panelists. It's been a very, very strong endorsement, Shyam, for what you have been doing. And I endorse this very strong endorsement by all our preceding speakers. See, the great thing about your work is that the range of issues which you cover in this book, in your earlier work and so on, is truly remarkable. You know, it's sort of just going through the chapter titles, one would be convinced that it's a very rich fare, and you do that by engaging with these in a very fine-grained manner and connecting that with appropriate analysis. Of course, you can't give all the answers, nobody can, but there is, you know, so much there to take home, to mull over, to reflect, and so on. And for that reason, yes, this collective thinking, working together is indeed something very important. And in that, you need to continue be an important voice. So please start thinking of your next book, hopefully on COVID too, and what happens to the world of labor. You know, as yes, I hope you have been encouraged very strongly by all our esteemed sort of preceding speakers, panelists, and so on. And good luck to you for a very long and active professional life and engaging with the world of work and so on. Yeah. So on that note, I certainly feel grateful to you for being there with your work and enlightening all of us. With that, may I now request Arjun to come to the closing ceremony or whatever he wishes to do. But Shyam, you want to say something, please?
Yeah. Yes. Please go on. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm truly humbled by the shower of such kind words and sentiments and strong advices. I don't know whether Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal cued the Great Depression or not. All your counsel has sort of cued my academic depression that I have been undergoing, primarily because I was writing and nothing is happening in response in the public discourses and other places and public policies. I was led to a point of disillusionment and a kind of academic depression. So what am I doing? Where is it leading to? Am I just publishing books and articles? And of course, it gives me great pleasure. And I'm carrying on the glorious tradition of my teachers. But the disillusionment was the primary reason. And of course, my health concerns, which are of course my personal matter, was that the great disillusionment was something that was working on my system, emotional, intellectual, and other systems. More importantly, the normative, the moral system, that the kind of impact that we should be making, we are not making. Of course, I would be glad to be the part of the huge collective voice of the people who are present here and who are outside elsewhere, and to do my humble bit. I'm greatly humbled by whatever you have said, and I would be happy to do what I can. And of course, there's a tonic for me, all the advices and the shower of kind words, and I would do. Of course, I'm sorry to be bringing religion or spiritual here. I leave it to the divine hand to take me wherever it takes me to. But I would conclude, I would say the last one, being a lover of Carnatic music, Saint Tyagaraja says in one of his songs, Endaro Mahanubhavalu Andariki Vandanavalu. All, I bow to all the great souls, great minds, great hearts. And of course, this is a cliche, but still a cliche worth clinging to. Thanks for all the kind words. I'm truly humbled. And Dr. Arjun Kumar, I think there is a media presence. If it is there, you may kindly continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. I'll just quickly propose a vote of thanks, but I will also add that since all of our teacher, in fact, Praveen sir, Professor Reddy, all of them are working so hard, which makes us, and sir, you are also from Jharkhand, Praveen sir also studied there, and we have to work more harder. And if you'll say so, what will have their impact on us? Because we look every day morning to your work and work further more harder towards to your leadership. And we are so thankful to all of you for joining here this day on this very important deliberation and book discussion on this book, Essays on COVID-19, Labor Market Reforms and the World of Work in India, by Professor K.R. Shyam Sundar, who is a professor at XLRI in Jamshedpur. And sir has also contributed so much and given this web policy talk today. And he has been working so hard on these issues. And we, from all of us here today, congratulate him for his book, very excellent book, and all his future endeavors. And we want him to be more active, more proactive, as Professor Reddy was also telling at the start. So we look forward to all of you. Let me just quickly propose a vote of thanks on behalf of Father Denzil Fernandez at Indian Social Institute, Rajiv Shah sir at Counterview, Dr. Meena Menon at Working People's Charter, and Dr. Simi Mehta at Center for Work and Welfare, IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, to propose this vote of thanks to all of you who have attended here, and especially our speaker and our special guest today, Professor D.N. Reddy, for his August presence here. It's very late, almost dinner time. And our chair for this deliberation, Professor Praveen Jha, Ramapriya Gopalakrishnan ma'am, thank you, Professor Babu Matthew, and Dr. Radhika Kapoor ma'am for joining here and enlightening all of us. I would also like to thank Professor Alak Narayan Sharma, who is the Director of Indian Institute for Human Development and Secretary of Indian Society for Labor Economics, for also supporting us, and he's also our mentor and my also personal guardian here. So thank all of you, and we look forward to your contribution and to all of your leadership to make India stronger and have some impactful contribution from our area of research to the actual India. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Reddy. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, bye. Thank you, Shyam. See you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.